Well, good evening. Hope you're having a good day today. As we meet together this evening, we will be entering into our study of the book of Daniel. We'll be in Daniel chapter 7 tonight. So you can go ahead and turn your Bibles there. Does anyone tonight need one of our handouts? We have handouts for chapter 7 and also the handouts for chapter 8. I see one. Caleb, will you help me? And then you can get the handout for chapter 8. This will be next week's class. Remember, every night you come on Wednesday evenings, you'll be able to get the class that we're doing tonight, which tonight is chapter 7. And you'll also be able to pick up the class that we will be doing next week. Now, next week we enter into Daniel chapter 8. Now, both of these two chapters, Daniel chapter 7 and Daniel chapter 8, are linked together in a unique way because these are visions or dreams that Daniel has. I want you to notice Daniel chapter 7, verse 1. You find Daniel, and you see him there in the middle of the verse. Daniel had a dream and visions of his head upon his bed. Then he wrote the dream and told the sum of the matters. These are dreams that are different than the other dreams in the book of Daniel. They're different from the other events inside the book of Daniel because these are occurring in the mind of Daniel. This is not a dream that was given to the king of which Daniel is going to interpret. He's already done that twice. Remember, Daniel interpreted a dream and gave the dream. And then later in the second occasion, Daniel interpreted the dream that the king was able to give. But both of those were dreams of the king. But in Daniel chapter 7 and Daniel chapter 8, you have the dreams that are specific to Daniel. And in our study tonight of Daniel chapter 7, you'll remember that we are out of order in the book. We started in Daniel chapter 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now we have moved to chapter 7. Next week we move to chapter 8. Now, you may be wondering again why we're doing that. This keeps things in chronological order, in order of the history as they were written. Now, the book is collected in different chapters and out of order for a variety of reasons. But one of being the way the languages this book was written in, it kept them in the language order of which they were. So we meet tonight in Daniel chapter 7 and then next week in Daniel chapter 8 in the chronological order of our study. We're going to look tonight at a vivid vision that Daniel had. He has this dream. We've already noticed verse 1, and we'll see the writing in just a moment. But as you are in this particular study, 4 different things I want us to see in our evening tonight. They're on the front of your handout. You're going to see the vision of 4. We're going to see 4 different things, and you'll see them in the handout, that lion, the bear, the leopard, and then this dreadful thing that Daniel does see. Then we're going to see the Ancient of Days. We're going to notice something about God. And in chapter 7 and in chapter 8, God is going to be the central figure. Because in chapter 7 and chapter 8 of the book of Daniel, you have more repetitive nature of the rise and fall of nations. And here's what we learn. I'll give you the overview of Daniel chapter 7 and chapter 8 in one sentence. God is in control. In everything that happens, God's going to give these great visions. And I've often wondered, Daniel chapter 7, Daniel chapter 8, were these given so that Daniel himself knew that God is in control? You'll remember in the previous chapters 1 through 4, that Daniel had to stand up for himself as well as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and say, we won't defile ourselves. Daniel had to interpret those dreams. And Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego had to stand up and not bow down to that great idol that the king had made. Daniel needed to recognize, I believe, that God is in control. Do we not need to know that as well in our lives? You know, ask yourself this question, and you can think about it as we go through the class. But why is the United States where the United States is right now? Is it because the United States is just so great, just so grand, just so well thought out? Or is it because, just like in the day of Daniel, Daniel chapter 7 and Daniel chapter 8, that God is still in control. That's what we're going to see tonight. Daniel sees that as well. So we'll see the Ancient of Days. We'll see the dominion that's given, and then we'll see the scene as we end with this vision that's going to be understood. So start with me tonight as we are in Daniel chapter 7, verse 1, and let's pick up and let's see the writing that takes place in this chapter that has to do with Daniel. It reads this way, verse 1. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head upon his bed. Then he wrote the dream and told the sum of the matters. Here's what Daniel chapter 7 is all about. Daniel had this dream. And evidently, as we look in Daniel chapter 7, verse 1, Daniel was upon his bed. And these visions, it's almost methodical and sounds interesting as you say it quickly. These dreams were in his head upon his bed, and then he wrote them down and he told the sum of the matter. So the first thing you have as you start Daniel chapter 7 is you have the writings. You move into verse 2 and you have the sight which goes down to verse 3. Read them with me. Daniel spake and said, I saw my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of the heaven strove upon the great sea. And the four great beasts came up from the sea, diverse one from another. Daniel has this great sight. Now what I like about this particular thing is in verse 2. Daniel says inside of his dream that he saw this vision, and there were four winds, and these four winds came from heaven. When you use the word four, sometimes you'll see the word four or the number four mentioning completeness. But what comes to mind when thinking about the earth and thinking about the number four, especially when considering directions? There are four somethings upon this earth, and they had to do with directions. Northeast, there we go. We get from every corner of the earth, Daniel says in this particular scene, these beasts were going to come, this wind, and it strives upon the great sea. He says these four beasts came up from the sea, this is verse 3, and they were all different. Now, when we get to verse 4 through 8, we'll begin to see what these things are. And especially as we make it later on in our class, we'll see exactly what these things are. But notice with me the very first one. This is verse 4. This is the lion. Verse 4, the first was like a lion and had eagle's wings, and I beheld till the wings thereof were plucked, and it was lifted up from the earth and made to stand upon the feet as a man, and a man's heart was given to it. There's a lot of imagery in Daniel chapter 7. Matter of fact, in the book of Daniel as a whole, you know this is reading it. There's a large amount of imagery. Here's what I want you to focus on. Daniel chapter 7, verse 4. There is a lion, and he stood as if he had the feet of men, and he had the heart of what? A man. Think about mankind. So you've got this image, the lion, first, number 1. Go to verse 5. You have the bear, and behold another beast, a second like a bear. And it raised itself up upon one side, and it had 3 ribs in the mouth of it between the teeth of it. And they said thus unto it, Arise, devour much flesh. So what do you see in verse 5? A lot of imagery going on in verse 5, but what do you see? You have a bear who stands on its side, it seems. It has something in his mouth, and there is this verbiage, this wordage is being said, and it tells it to devour, after it arises, much flesh. So what do you have? You've got a lion, you've got a bear. Move into verse 6, you have the leopard. After this I beheld, and lo, another like the leopard, which had upon the back of it 4 wings of a fowl, and the beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. So what do you have now? Well, you've got a leopard. Now this one's a little bit more extravagant, much like the one in verse 4. You've got a leopard which upon its back had 4 different wings. And inside of this leopard, as you follow it along, it also had 4 heads. Have you ever seen anything like that? Nobody. You ever seen anything like that? Okay, think about the vivid imagery that's in this book. Now, what could we do so far in Daniel chapter 7 as we've made it to verse 6? What could we say right now? What is Daniel 7 verse, if we just took verses 1 through 6, what is the book of Daniel, especially chapter 7, about? We need to learn something about the book of Daniel tonight. This is the first thing we're going to learn together. Looking at Daniel chapter 7, verses 1 through 6, hey, let's even be impressive. Let's go down to verse 8. We're going to see that dreadful in just a minute. If you just take the first 8 verses, what do you know about chapter 7? You only know... Okay, things are not what they always are made out to be. Okay, that's a good statement. It's definitely unusual. I've never seen any of these things. Have you ever seen a lion of which had eagle's wings and it had feet of men? Well, me neither. Have you seen the bear of Daniel chapter 7, verse 5? Have you seen the leopard of Daniel chapter 7, verse 6? Or this dreadful beast, verses 7 and 8? What do we know about the book of Daniel chapter 7 so far? Here's what we know. We only have part. What we interpret of Daniel chapter 7 can not only come from Daniel chapter 7 verses 1 through 8, because we are only given in the first 8 verses the vision of which Daniel had. We don't have the interpretation yet. So what I'm trying to tell you is, when you are studying the book of Daniel, a book with vivid imagery, maybe if you're studying the book of Isaiah that covers a lot of history, or 1st and 2nd Chronicles, or even the book of Revelation, which once again is filled with vivid imagery, what do you have to do in the chapters and in the context of which those chapters are set? You've got to see the whole. Don't make any decisions on Daniel chapter 7 in verses 1 through 8, because we only have part of the story. So that's our lesson number 1 tonight. But keep going with me in verses 7 and 8. Let's see this dreadful that takes place. This is a... Yes, sir, verse 6. Yes, sir.
Alexander the Great conquered all of the Middle East, all the way to India, and he would have gone on into India had he thought it was worthwhile. And he did all of that within a period of 10 years.
That's right. Swift. And all of this, remember, these 4 depictions, we're going to kind of get up ahead of ourselves. These are going to talk about kingdoms and the men who rule those kingdoms. God is always in control with the rise and fall of nations. So see this last one. This is verses 7 and 8. It might be the most vivid of them all. Verse 7, after I saw this, or I saw in the night visions, behold, a 4th beast. He was dreadful and terrible, strong exceedingly, and it had great iron teeth. It devoured and brake into pieces, and it stamped the residue with the feet of it. And it was diverse from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. I considered the horns, and behold, there came up another among them, a little horn, before whom there was 3 of the first horns plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. Now, we're not told what these great things are, but Daniel says he sees these things inside of his dream. He sees these things inside of his vision. What do you know about verses 7 and 8, this dreadful beast that's before Daniel? Well, he's different than all the rest, isn't he? The others had some semblance of mankind to them. The first, that lion, it had feet of men. It had a heart of man. The others kind of give this semblance of some degree of tameness, but this dreadful. He says it was exceedingly dreadful, and it was strong. It was something I would suggest, like you and I would say about ourselves, something that David had never seen. So let me ask you this. What does all this mean? What does all that mean? Who wants to interpret that for us? I know somebody wants to. How do we know the answer to that question? I'm trying to get you to see something. Remember the first point we've learned tonight? We've only seen the part. We've only seen the part. Now listen, we could spend a lot of time tonight, and we're going to do a little bit of this. We're not going to do a lot of it. But we could spend a lot of time tonight looking at these 4 different beasts and looking at the rise and fall of the nations and the kingdoms as took place in history. But what are you learning? Daniel chapter 7. What is Daniel learning? Daniel chapter 7. What has Nebuchadnezzar already learned in the previous chapters? God is in control. Okay, listen, we're going to say this till we're sick of hearing it tonight, but who is in control? Okay, listen, we could spend the next 4 weeks, 1 week at a time, looking at these different characters. We could look at that lion, we could look at that bear, the leopard, and this dreadful. And we could link them with all of the different people, like Alexander the Great that was mentioned just a moment ago. Matter of fact, in Daniel chapter 8, we're going to talk about Alexander the Great, and we're going to talk about the other men who rose up to power in the kingdoms that took place. And you're going to see, as we look in these particular things, the different things that took place.
The 10 horns in chapter 7,
Yes, sir.
does that represent 10 nations or 10 rulers, or do we not know?
You're going to find in Daniel chapter 7, and I'll back us up here in the PowerPoint, these 10 horns, and even as you look at that part, I personally think it's 10 different rulers that are coming along, only because of the way things seem to happen in history. These 10 horns, especially as you look at verse 8, he considered the horns. There came up among them a little horn, and one which had 3 of the first horns plucked up by its roots. Many individuals talk about these as Roman emperors or other individuals. But here's what I know. I know that these times have already passed, because as you look at the dating and the writing of the book of Daniel, the years that are being described in the book of Daniel have already passed. Okay, we need to know that right now. These visions, these dreams that were going to take place, they have taken place. Now, even like when you go to Daniel chapter 2, verse 44, what was Daniel 2:44 about? It was the coming kingdom. Now, has that kingdom come? It's the church. The church is here. Go to Acts chapter 2. So Daniel 2, Joel 2, Isaiah 2, Acts 2, all those things collide together. And just like this, I believe personally, Willard, that these are 10 different rulers. Here's what I can tell you about verse 8. Every person that either writes about it or teaches it has a different variation on the different groups from verse 4 down to verse 8. I'm choosing in our class tonight to be less specific about who these were and how they were to conquer the world. Here's what I know. You go back to Daniel chapter 2, that great image that was created. What was that about? The rise and fall of the nations. And who was in control? God was in control. The same thing taking place here. So you have first, number one, these visions that take place, which moves us into verse 9, which talks about the Ancient of Days. And let's talk about this one. Let's just read Daniel 7, verse 9 together. He says, I beheld till the thrones were cast down. The Ancient of Days did sit, whose garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head was like pure wool. His throne was like a fiery flame, and his wheels are as a burning fire. The American Standard Version translates it a little bit differently. Instead of cast down, he says that he viewed this or beheld this until these thrones were placed. Who places the kingdom of men in operation? Say that again. That's right. That's right. So who set up government? God set up governments. Who involves Daniel chapter 2, the rise and fall of nations? God does. So who is this one, verse 9, who could set things in order, not necessarily cast them down, but put them into their place? I do too. Who is the one that's depicted as perfectly pure? It's God or Christ, isn't it? This very idea inside of this verse 9, the garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head was like pure wool. Look at the concept of purity here. God is the only one that you and I can know or understand that defines the word purity. Ask yourself a personal question. Does your life define the word purity? It should. But have we always been pure? The answer is, for all of us, the answer is no. But God is the one who is sitting on all these things. He is the Ancient of Days, and He did sit. The prevailing state of affairs, verses 1 through 9, would not take place if God did not sit upon His throne.
This perfect picture of God
Yes.
is similar to what we find in Ezekiel
Yes, sir.
10
Yes, sir.
and Revelation 4.
Yes, sir. And you'll also find similar statements talking about how we are made pure in the book of Isaiah. I remember when our sins are removed, that concept of white. So here you have God sitting upon His throne. He is the one, and inside of this one, or with this one, verse 10, are these books. A fiery stream issued and came forth before Him. Thousands and thousand ministers ministered unto Him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before Him. The judgment was said, and the books were opened. I find verse 10 maybe to be the most vivid of the imagery here inside of Daniel chapter 7. I think it would of necessity have to be angels. There are some people who have some different thoughts about what this might be inside of verse 10. I can't imagine that it would be mankind sitting before God or ministering unto God. Who is the one that ministers to man? God ministers to man, doesn't He? Think about that for just a minute. It's an odd way to think about God, but who went to the cross for us? Who created us? Who sustains us? Who establishes us? Who gives us hope? Who ministers to man? God ministers to man. I wouldn't think it was man. But in this, Daniel sees this. He sees all these individuals. And the concept is, at least in verse 10, the judgment was set. I believe verse 10 talks to us about how when God has made decisions, when God has said it, He means it. When you read the Old Testament, or even when you read the New Testament, when do you ever find God making a mistake? That's right. We also see Him after the flood and those decisions type matters. But when God says He's going to do something, how much trust can we put in that? Remember, this is back to our theme. We're going to get tired of it. Who's in control? God is in control of all things. So verse 10, here He is. Now these books, I'll go ahead and tell you, I have great questions about what these books are. Is it the books of the rise and fall of man? I think that may be more aptly what it might be. Some have suggested that this is the book of life. You read about that in the book of Revelation and other places. It does make you think that. And here's why I think it's some type of book that talks about the rise and fall of man. What is this chapter about? I know it's about God is in control, but what is being stated? Well, there was that lion, there was that bear, there was that leopard, there was that dreadful, and these are referring to nations that were to come along and their attributes that would be. So in the context of Daniel chapter 7, verse 10 talks about this book and this judgment. Well, God said these nations were going to be, and we don't know who they are yet reading in the book. I believe the judgments have to do with what God has already said. He stated they are true. The books were open. I agree with you too. Yes, sir. I agree with that too. That's right. It could very well be. 100%. So you've got God, you've got the decision maker. We've seen Him as the one. We've seen Him with the books. Let's see Him as the one that's described, or as this particular description, the destruction that takes place, verse 11. I beheld then because of the voice of the great words which the horn spake, I beheld even till the beast was slain and his body destroyed and given to the burning flame. There's this great destruction in Daniel chapter 7. What do you think the beast was, Daniel 7:11? What was the beast? Roman Empire. I believe that is exactly who was talked about in Daniel chapter 7, verses 7 through 8. I believe the beast of verse 11 was the beast inside of Daniel 7, 7 and 8. We've already seen Daniel saying that he was awake to see all these things in his vision. So he saw the rise and fall of nations in his vision. Now, does that mean that Daniel in his vision saw every moment of every bit of time that took place from the very beginning of the vision until the fall of the Roman Empire? I don't think that's what it meant. I also don't want to at the same time say that's not what it meant. If God wanted to show Daniel every moment from the time the vision entered of which he lived until the fall of the Roman Empire, could God show him every moment? That's right. I believe God could have shown that. And this nation's going to be destroyed. Now, let me ask you a question. This is a side note. This is lesson number 2. Lesson number 1, God is always in control and we can depend on Him. Lesson number 2, really lesson number 1 is read the context of the chapter. I'll get back to that. Our theme tonight is God is in control. Lesson number 2 comes in verse 11. What causes the destruction of a nation? What caused the destruction of Rome? Do what? Immorality and sin. What's going to cause the destruction of our nation? Same thing. Now, I've said this statement before. I still believe in this statement, but the problem with sin is that the only thing that's changing is the people. Sin is still in existence. It was in existence in the day of Daniel. It was in existence in the day of Rome that we're talking about, I believe, in verse 11, this great end of all these things. Is sin still in existence today? We don't like to say that, but is sin still in existence? Does it still exist in the national form like we're talking about here? Sin took care of Rome, didn't it? Because the majority of Rome was what? Sin. That's right, pagan, sinful. Same thing we need to consider for our own country. It was. Matter of fact, most nations have all been defeated from within. Think about man in the Garden of Eden. How was man defeated in the Garden of Eden? It was from within, wasn't it? How is the church defeated? I don't like to talk about that. How is the church defeated usually? From within. Most nations are defeated from within. Rome was defeated from within. So you have this great destruction, but yet inside of this book, there's also this rest. This is verse 12. As concerning the rest of the beast, they had their dominion taken away, yet their lives were prolonged for a season and time. Oh. All these others, this would be that lion, that bear, and that leopard. They had their season, yet they were destroyed as well. Now they were prolonged. Matter of fact, some of these nations that we're reading about, some of them teamed together, some of them pooled together. Different things took place in the rise and fall of the nations, but they were prolonged. And look at what Daniel says as we roll into the next scene. This is going to take us to the dominion. This is verses 10, and will take us down to verse 14 in our study. Let's see the dominion given. I want you to see the Son. This is Daniel chapter 7, verse 13. Verse 13 reads this way, I saw in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man came with the clouds of heaven, and came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. We have this individual. He's called the Son, like the Son of Man. Now, think about this for just a minute. We've got God described in the book. Now, who do we have? Verse 13. Jesus. Now, inside of inside of this particular scene, especially inside of your handout, under the dominion given, the top of your inside pane, that should be verse 13. It has verse 10 there. But think about verse 10 or verse 13. Who's involved? Who is given dominion? Well, it's the Son. Who is the Son? It's Christ. Go back to Daniel chapter 2. What was that kingdom that was going to be established? The church. Who is going to rule over the church and who is going to establish the church? It's the same one being talked about here in Daniel 7, verse 13. You have his rule, verse 14. And there was given him dominion and glory and a kingdom that all people, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed. This is akin, or Daniel chapter 7, verse 14, is akin to Daniel chapter 2, verse 44, that kingdom that would never be destroyed. But I want you to see a few things about this kingdom that you and I are a part of inside of the church. He was given dominion, glory in this kingdom. Now look at the middle of the verse, that all people, nations, and languages should serve who? Him. Now, think about this for just a minute, because after we pass verse 14, we've really got to get moving through this chapter to finish up in an appropriate time tonight. But think about this. Throughout the world, there are different nations, there are different peoples, and there are different languages. Is there anyone in this world who cannot serve him? Can you name me a country of which cannot serve God? A nation. Can you name me a people, maybe a descendant group that cannot serve God? Or can you name me a particular people that speak in a particular language that cannot serve God? You're right, there are. Let me ask you this question. If pre-adventure, we get here Sunday morning and the doors are locked and a sign is written from the government, you cannot worship anymore, what are you going to do? I'm still going to serve him. There are nations where people cannot serve God. You're right. That's right. And we can always be a people who serve him. And I love the last part. His dominion, this is the dominion of Christ, is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away. And his kingdom, not just his dominion, but his kingdom, what will happen to it? It will never be destroyed. Here's lesson number 3 for us tonight. Number 1, you've got to get the whole of the chapter. But number 3, you and I need to recognize that the church will always exist. But I want to give a little side note to that. That does not mean it will always exist here. How do you and I ensure that the church will always meet or exist here? The church is always going, this kingdom is always going to exist. But how do we ensure that it exists here? Got to keep pressing on. It's a very good way to put it. You be involved in your world. That's right. But how do I ensure it? Folks, the answer's right here. Though our government may stop us, the one thing that may destroy us is from within. Isn't that right? Isn't that what we learned about Rome? How do we ensure it here? We stay with the Lord here. So you see this great dominion that's given. Now the rest of the chapter is going to be this vision that is understood. Now from verse 15 all the way down to verse 28, you're going to see this vision that's understood. Now we're not going to look at every verse in detail from this point on. We're going to see them. We're going to kind of summarize them to a degree. We're going to read verses 15 through 17 together as we roll into this particular scene. And we're going to give all of these little depictions as we've done for the verses like verse 15. It's going to be this trouble because Daniel says something at this, and I want you to read down to verse 17 to see it. But just read 15 through 17. I, Daniel, was grieved in my spirit in the midst of my body, and the visions of my head troubled me. I came near unto the one of them that stood by and asked him the truth of all this. So he told me and made known the things, or the interpretation of the things. These great beasts, which are all four, are 4 kings which shall arise out of the earth. So what you have is you have the trouble, you have the answer, and you have the kings. Number 1, Daniel was troubled by what he saw. What would you think? Now, you're not getting visions from God, but just put yourself in the shoes of Daniel for just a minute. You had a vision, and what you saw inside of your vision was the lion, the bear, the leopard, and the dreadful. Would that bother you? Well, what would you do? Well, Daniel, as you see the answer, Daniel asked. Inside of all of this, Daniel asked, what do these things mean? Well, this is the Kings, verse 17. These great beasts, which are four. There are four kings, which tells me there's four nations involved in these kings. And these four kings and these four nations, they're going to arise where, Daniel? In your world. See, this world is not the home of God. Now, God's in control of this world, don't get me wrong. But this world is not the home of God. Who lives here? Now, don't hear me saying that God does not belong here. Should God reside in our homes? Of course He should. Should God reside here? Of course He should. So you have this vision that's understood. Now, what you have is you move from verse 17 down to verse 18. You have this possession. Verse 18, but the saints of the Most High shall take the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, even forever and ever. There is a concept inside of Scripture, and it's found here in Daniel 7:18. It's also found as you read the words in the New Testament, especially after the book of Acts, from Romans down to Jude. There is the concept of you and I who have taken ownership or possession of this said kingdom. Now, you and I are not in control of the church, are we? You and I are not sitting on the throne of judgment in the church, are we? Who sits upon the throne of the church? It's Christ. Not us, Christ. But there is this concept of ownership among you and I of the church. Why is that? Why is there ownership within the church? You ever thought about that? Why should you feel great sense of pride in the church? Why should you feel great sense of need to make sure things are right? That's right. Remember what the church is for. The church is for us. And isn't that a sense of ownership, isn't it? If you are in Christ and the church belongs to Christ, not only is Christ the one that owns the church, but you have a reason to act right and to make sure it's treated right. There is this possession. The saints of the Most High, they shall take the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, even forever and ever. Now let's see the truth. This is verse 19. Then I would know the truth of the fourth beast, which was diverse from all the other beasts. Now pause with me, verse 19. Evidently, as I think it would you and I, this fourth beast really bothered Daniel. The other three were sort of normal. Okay, they weren't normal, but we can envision that. But that fourth beast, it was different than all the rest, and it seemed to devour all the rest, and it almost seemed unstoppable. I don't, because it's talking about a kingdom, number one, that's going to rise up out of the earth. Satan did not arise here in the very beginning. And then the concept of Satan did not come from man. These kingdoms certainly arose up out of this earth. Now, do I believe that Satan's involved? Do you think Satan was involved when Nebuchadnezzar had a fiery furnace? I do. Do you think Satan was involved when Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and Daniel were given meat and drink that would defile them against the Most High God? I do. Do you think the devil's involved when you're tempted? I do. Matthew chapter 4, verses 1 through 11, who tempted Jesus? He's involved. But remember, who else is involved? Who's in control? Now, if God is in control of the rise and fall of nations, if God can handle all of that, we can't wrap our minds around that. If God can handle that, can't we let God handle our lives, which is much smaller and insignificant in compared to the rise and fall of nations? I think we can. So he says in this, it was different. He says it was exceedingly dreadful, whose teeth were of iron, his nails were of brass, which devoured and brake into pieces and stamped the residue with his feet. Almost a repeat of what we read in verses 7 and 8. He was concerned about this beast. He gives the truth about it. He would know the truth about it. He would find out about it. He would figure out what it was, and that's verses 20 and 21. Let's get the look. Verse 20 and 21. The 10 horns were of his head, and the other which came up, which before him three fell. Even that horn that had eyes and a mouth that spake great things, whose look was more stout than his fellows. By the way, his fellows, that's why I believe there were different kings inside of that empire. I beheld the same horn made war with the saints and prevailed against them. Was there ever a time when the nation of Rome persecuted Christians? Was there ever a time when the nation of Rome, it made war with the saints and it made them scatter? What country did that? What nation? Rome. It's the one we're talking about. People have different interpretations of what those other beasts might be, but Rome is very significant here. He prevailed against the saints. And look at verse 23. This is the fourth. Then he said, the fourth beast shall be the fourth kingdom upon the earth, which shall be diverse from all the kingdoms, and shall devour the whole earth, and shall tread it down, and shall break it into pieces. Rome was truly going to conquer the world. And in many aspects, in many rights, they did. Then you have these 10, I believe these are these 10 kingdoms and kings. And the 10 horns out of this kingdom are the 10 kings that shall arise, and another shall rise after them, and he shall be diverse from the last, and he shall subdue 3 kings. By the way, if you look into Roman history, you will see different kings rising, different kings falling. You will see different kings who rose up above the rest. We're not going to get into a historical lesson about Rome tonight, but you can go back and look at that. But I want you to get the picture. What does this tell us? This was many years before Rome. What does this tell us? Who is still in control? Yes, sir. I'd love to explain that to you, and here's my answer. I don't know. Listen, we're going to get to points in the book of Daniel, just like in the book of Revelation. I don't know all the answers to this book. I don't know why there were 3 kings that were subdued by 1. But here's what I know. It's the same thing you know. Who said it? Who said it? Was it Daniel that created this vision, or was it God? Therefore, will it be true? Is Rome the power it used to be? Rome has fallen, isn't that correct? That means that king has fallen. These kingdoms, these 10. Now, I want you to see some more things. These are the last 4 things we're going to see. Let's see the dividing that takes place. This is Daniel 7, verse 25. And he shall speak great words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and think to change times and laws, and they shall be given into his hand until a time and times to the dividing of times. Going to verse 26. But the judgment shall sit, and they shall take away his dominion and consume and destroy it unto the end. You have the dividing, this great one. He's a king of Rome. He's going to do this dividing, but he's not going to last forever. I believe one of the 4th things we learn inside of this book is evil will not always reign. Out of all the rise and fall, these 4 nations that are described in Daniel chapter 7, the first 8 verses, many of them were evil. But what was going to come out of this? It was verses 13 and 14. This king and this kingdom, is the church evil? That's a weird question, isn't it? That's very strange. Evil will not always prevail. At times it does. Does evil ever prevail in our world? Every day, I agree with you. Are there unjust murders in our world? Every day. Are there wicked imaginations in our world? Every day. Have you ever experienced evil in your life? If you haven't, you will. Hopefully not every day. That's right. If you haven't, you're not honest with yourself. But think about this. With all the evil in our world, there's still a kingdom that will never do you wrong. Now maybe, just maybe, that's what Daniel chapter 7 is supposed to be all about. I believe it's about the fact that Daniel needs to know that God is in control in the rise and fall of nations. And we're going to repeat this in Daniel chapter 8. But here's the truth. When Daniel faced defiling God, that was evil. He faced evil. But God was still there. Good was still there. Whenever there's evil, there's always good. In every tragedy, look for the positive. It's there. We just don't see it right away. So this one, he's going to continue. He's going to be this judge. He's going to judge. And there's going to be this giving, verse 27. And the kingdom and dominion and the greatness under the kingdom, under the whole heaven, shall be given unto the people of the saints of the Most High, whose kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and all dominion shall serve and obey him. All right, now we're talking about a specific kingdom, verse 27. What kingdom is talked about? What kingdom and dominion is talked about? Well, it's the kingdom of Christ, isn't it? And it's Christ's dominion that's being talked about. And this great kingdom, verse 27, this great kingdom, it's going to have the saints in it. They're going to be the saints of the Most High, whose kingdom, now listen to this again, is an everlasting kingdom. When's the church going to die? It's not. Matter of fact, when the world ends, what is the one thing that will continue to stand? The kingdom. That's why you read in Jesus, oftentimes in parable form and in other forms of speech, he says, the kingdom of heaven is likened unto, many times talking about in eternity. The church will never be destroyed. Jesus is not coming back to destroy the church, is he? What is Jesus coming back to destroy? There are three things left to be destroyed. What are they? Death, sin, and the devil. Those still exist. They will be destroyed. What else is going to be destroyed, by the way? There is a fourth thing. Everything and all of its content, the earth and all its things. But thinking about these kind of spiritual matters, sin, the devil, and death. But what is not going to be destroyed? The kingdom and the dominion. Now listen to this, verse 27. And the saints. The saints will not be destroyed. I think that, ladies and gentlemen, is something you and I need to be given. We need to be given hope in this world. We live in an unusual time. Anybody disagree with that? You know it is. But here's what we know. And we're going to see this, matter of fact, next week when we start chapter 8, we're going to start chapter 8 with verse 27. That's the end of the chapter. And those things in Daniel chapter 8, they troubled Daniel. Has anything ever troubled you? All right, let me ask you this very specific question. How many things in 2020 have troubled you? Now, I don't know how many things are left in 2020. We might just be getting started. Here's what I know. Mass, no mass, virus, no virus, murder hornets, no murder hornets. Explosions throughout the entire world. Did you see today the explosion in Lebanon? A facility exploded, and for about 15 miles, every window was shattered. That's something they've never seen before. I hope we never see something like that. There's tragedies every day, and it seems this year is just full of them. There are political disasters going on, and no matter what is going on, who is still in control? Now listen to this. This is a bigger question for us. What kingdom will never be destroyed? The church. Now here's the big question. God has given the church to mankind. Here's the big one. Are you a part of it? We'll talk about that in just a minute. Let's see the last thing. This is the keeping. Hitherunto is the end of the matter. As for me, Daniel, my cogitations much troubled me, and my countenance changed in me, but I kept the matter in my heart. It doesn't seem to me, at least in verse 28, that Daniel spoke these things out loud again. I don't know if he did or not. He says, verse 28, he kept them in his heart. It makes me think that he never said them. And by the way, chapter 8 is going to be a similar thing. He's going to tell some people, but not this great proclamation like the two dreams before. Boy, he kept that in his heart. It troubled him. But here's what I know. This is only about, matter of fact, next week will be where we're at in Daniel chapter 8 with the future rise. This is only about midway through the life of Daniel. And there's a lot more to go. He's still got to go to the lion's den, by the way. Now, I know that chapter 7 is not the most riveting chapter. Let me go ahead and tell you something about next week, chapter 8. It's a little less riveting. It's a little bit more dry, but we're learning a lesson. Daniel needed to learn this lesson, and Daniel's going to receive another vision, another dream. Who's in control? And I want us to let that be the end of our lesson as we think about tonight. This vision of 4, the Ancient of Days, which is God, the dominion which is given to Jesus, and the vision tells Daniel that God is always in control. Let's ask a question as we conclude tonight. Who is in control of your life? Now listen, I don't know what tomorrow brings. You don't either. I hope it brings something good. Don't you? But I want to ask you a question. What if it brings something to you like Daniel chapter 7, verse 28, where it troubles your heart, where it changes your countenance for the rest of your life, and something is so devastating to you that you keep it to yourself? That's where Daniel is. Now, I don't want that to happen to me. Do you? But let me ask you this. What if tragedy befalls us tomorrow? I know it's hard during times of tragedy to say that God is in control, but if tragedy befalls us tomorrow, what do we know about God? He's still in control. I don't know how Daniel had such a great faith, do you? I mean, we had the very good idea he put God first, and therefore everything he did, God was involved. But Daniel had this great faith, and even though he went through tragedy after tragedy, problem after problem, guess who was still first? God. Why? Because God was in control of the nations, but listen to this. God was in control of Daniel. And the only person that could decide that was Daniel. What will you decide tonight? Maybe you're here tonight. We're going to think about the invitation for just a moment. Riley's going to lead us in a song, and we'll all have the opportunity to respond to the Lord. But maybe tonight you need to become a Christian. Well, I've got some really good news for you. There's a baptistry prepared. There's water there. There are towels and other items for you. If you want to be a part of the kingdom, Daniel 7, 13 and 14, that will never be destroyed, you can tonight. Acts chapter 2, verse 38 tells you must repent and be baptized. 1 Peter 3:21 tells us it's not the washing of the body, but it's the answer to God. And you and I can know, Acts 2:47, that we're added to the Lord's church by the Lord himself. There's not going to be a vote. There's not going to be an investigation. There's not going to be anything. The Lord will take care of that. In other words, Acts 2:47, who's still in control? God's still in control. Maybe you're here tonight and you need to make your life right with the Lord. There's not a Christian in this world that will live his life a life of perfection on his own. That starts with me and it goes to you. By the way, it goes all the way back to the people before us, and it's going to reach into the future of the people that are after us if this world stands that long. And not a single one of us is perfect on our own. Sometimes we need to come home like the prodigal. He went out and lived his life. He lived in sin, but he finally recognized, I sinned against my Father in heaven. And he came home willing to be a servant, by the way. Remember that. How many in his Father's house had it better than he? He came back to be a servant. You can come home tonight and know that God will forgive you. Remember in the account of the prodigal, where was the father when the son returned? He was standing there looking afar off, and he ran to meet him, and he brought him back into the house. Well, that's the image of the Lord that you and I can have tonight. Maybe you need to become a Christian tonight. Maybe you need to make your life right with the